welcome to a DataVis working session about the DVP DataVis platform. We are basically building, three instances of one product, which is sort of the non-academic version of visualizing that started with UREX, and you see left and right other instances, and they're truly separate. So I'm wanting to start with that and also make sure to introduce Joe, VJ, co-pilot and developer on this. So we will definitely take things from there and hopefully end up on the outline with setting you guys up. I will share with you some of the goals, a little bit also connected to active projects and other products available. Again, this started a couple of years back, but instead of making this an anecdotal approach, we want to make sure that we're discussing and get feedback on potential solutions for gaps that we might have and not find elsewhere. So with that in mind, we have a stormwater categoric setup with Stormwater NYC. That is basically a stormwater project. The report did not get publicly sort of published, but this is the digital arm that has essentially all the scenarios that are for public consumption there. So just think of it as a topic stormwater. The picture on the right is the UREX city-focused version. So it's really inspired by cross-city comparison. It has 10 cities in it, with the latest edition being Atlanta. And then we have nyc.urbansystemslab.com, which is what we are doing today. Think of it as the larger metropolitan area sandbox that is truly New York focused. Pretty much any one of us is somehow connected to also a New York City focused project. But this is also where these things should go, right? So if we have something that's sort of a GCR UREX bin, it goes to the UREX. If it's stormwater focused and also Office of Resiliency focused, it goes there. And we would like to lower the bar today in terms of getting you set up as editors and use this as a sandbox to test certain things for your publication efforts. Cool. So again, this is the New York focus. nyc.urbansystemslab is what you should be looking at. This is here a cookbook reference for something that we just use to make sure if someone actually gets started, is worried about how it works and what kind of OSM base map is there and how does a tile server work. So terminology and things like that are here. And this is also a deck Chris, feel free already to start sharing folks who are on this call into. Again, this is explaining some of these resources so you don't have to take notes. We will not go through this, but I want to give a shout out in terms of format requirements and things that are really Mapbox focused are in here. This is one of the most important features that you might not have utilized, but has been mostly appreciated by folks working actively on these projects, and that's essentially that you share exactly the view in a live Mapbox map with somebody through social media, a short link. And by having essentially a link that means the same thing for everybody, but a live map, you will see the most latest update at all times. So you're not taking a screenshot, you're basically sharing a view, right? And so just simply that, for everybody also on the story maps team and thinking about what updates what. It's a single source, an active source, and it's not a screenshot. One thing that we will discuss is that because it's a live map that is loaded, it sometimes is heavy, in between a blog post, but Mapbox has also a way to make this a static map where it's still the latest, it's still updated, but it just shows as an image. So I would love to have some of these conversations of what's useful, just strategically for sharing. The most important feature through GCR added is the Explorer feature, where you can actually compare, contrast across multiple layers. Also in a stack, and you see the legend stack on the right kind of add up. So there's combinations certainly possible that are nonsensical, overwhelming, or illegible, but we are essentially doing this to test that exactly out. Some of the comparisons immediately, just in terms of what you see, are exciting. And I think the database platform has really gained from this, but it doesn't keep anybody safe, right? If you're switching it all on and look at everything at once, you have to literally go through all of the colorams to make sense of them and sort of see that. So thank you, Claudia, for making also a comprehensive color scheme approach, which at least keeps it consistent across. Yeah, so when you log in, you see suddenly things like these blue buttons show up, manage style, sources, etc. So everything becomes editable. This is the goal for today, is that once you're an editor, you can do all of those things, and sometimes they need a little bit of digging, sense making to get them going, and we're here to help. But we're balancing as a database team always duties that are to the project, a lack of just platform development funds for doing stuff, and we can't necessarily build something that takes 100 hours to build that someone saves 10 minutes. So we need to know where the gaps are in the usability, and that's where feedback happens to say, okay, if I could just do that, I would actually use it. But we can't sort of preemptively build them without that kind of feedback cycle, and the session today is also about that. So this is one of these kind of waypoint story maps that also Tisha authored, simply by having a text and a map that stays stable on the left, where you take literally from one point to another, zoom level changes, perspective changes. You can literally kind of fly around a place, walk through a neighborhood, essentially also close level and sort of make points. Something that is, I think, a good use of the platform, because it's sort of map focused. If you have done story maps and you've worked on other things, products before, typically a storytelling, very long single page experience allows you to take these sort of milestones. This one sort of keeps it zeroed in, and you have the text, long, medium, short, image based on the right. It's basically a blog post that you fully design. The map feature means you're providing context. You can stack them, prioritize them, delete them all through UI. And because it's UI and not code, there's a couple of modals that just are triggered and pulled up, and getting you guys navigated through this is something that Joe screen shares in a moment as a case study. Yeah, I would like to see you guys in this list. If you're interested, right? So if you're interested in your chat, just add the email address we use to add you here, and we'll do that sort of one by one. And then you'll get at some point a Google email, a little nondescript saying, oh, you're resetting your password, sort of a reset password invitation, and then you're in. Actions, we'll get to this, but essentially something that you don't see too much advertised in regards to being able to make a slide presentation there, do a flyover, things like this, not really used so far. Later, these kinds of things can be handled in Mapbox. That means also digital twin futures could potentially become layers, and just another version of getting closer to the built environment. Same for synthetic architecture. So we'll go here. In terms of pipeline, so everything we do is usually in exchange formats of shapefiles and raster. They are heavy. They cannot be downloaded, obviously, you know that. So what happens is in the preparation, Mapbox is really the shared pipeline here, which hosts tile sets. So getting tile sets to show up, look good, and maybe even look at different zoom levels is basically that work that Joe has been leading out for these efforts. He will talk about some of these overlaps or also potentials. We had, for instance, sewage overflows would become markers when you're zoomed out. You get closer, you see the more detailed. So there's sort of mixtures of that available. Okay, so because we're now talking about Mapbox source URLs, it is an invitation to collaborate. So we currently have everything on Urban Systems Lab account. Everybody can get into Mapbox, for free without a credit card. Can open Mapbox Studio, drag and drop into their shapefiles and rasters, and make every label in Mapbox customized if wanted. And then you click on share, publish, and that source URL can be also embedded officially in the database platform without you even using, the Urban Systems Labs account. Another way to prepare things or say, hey, how about this one, right? So you basically do your thing, follow your tutorials, use R, Python, whatever you use to also generate those maps, export them from QGIS, but then sort of Mapbox is the goalkeeper to make them tiles, and once they're tiles, we can host them. So that's sort of the one possible scenario. I think it's time I'll hand over to Joe, because we are now getting sort of into the IDs of them all, and we should go to the next item from here. Joe, you want to screen share?
Of course, yeah. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, thanks for making time, Joe.
Of course, yeah. One sec.
We have to buy Joe a camera at some point in the second year of online.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Fantastic. Okay, yeah. So what I'm going to do, as Daniel's already gotten into a bit, is basically just run through the full feature set that we've been working on this site as it relates to some of the Mapbox infrastructure, as well as some of both the UI features and the content management that we've got on top of that. So yeah, the site basically functions as this lightweight content management system and UI feature set on top of Mapbox hosted datasets. And so what that means is Mapbox is responsible both for rendering the base map that you see here, as well as any of the editor defined layers on top of it, which are currently present in the left-hand side, as well as storing the actual data defining those layers on the Mapbox servers, which is great because these data sets are huge, and the fact that we can offload all of that to Mapbox just for very simple referencing means that the site itself is kept very lightweight. And so the way that that's accomplished is those data sets can be linked to the DVP by their Mapbox URLs and then referenced by the styles of each of these individual maps, which of course are defined by a combination of the location, in this case, New York City, the data itself, and then any potential optional narrative content and actions. And so what you see currently right here is the public-facing version of the site. And so anyone who goes to nyc.urbansystemslab has read access to everything you see here in terms of public maps. And then in order to get into the editing side for these maps, you would sign into an editor position or a permissioned account like mine is. So once I've done that, you can see all of these different editor-specific UI interactions pop up, and I can run through each of these one by one. So the general flow, right, is for a permissioned editor on the site, you first define map sources using those Mapbox URLs. You define a location using a location modal via the name, obviously, in this case, New York City, the lat long location, zoom level, etc., which can be done through this edit location modal. And then using these parameters, this will define the default camera location associated with that location. So once I've done that and I've saved it, and then I refresh the page, obviously it will know to recenter everything on the New York City lat long with a zoom level of 13 or 14 or whatever it is, with the default map. Right then, to begin, you need the actual Mapbox data. And so the way that we've been doing that, for example, for Eurex and some of our other data requirements, is by using the Urban Systems Labs Mapbox account, processing different GIS data, which is coming from a variety of data scientists, including those at the lab, from a variety of different GIS formats, including those for raster-specific and vector-specific data, all of which eventually gets consolidated into uniform MB tile-based files that can then be uploaded to the Mapbox site for reference. And so what you see here is the list of the variety of style sets that we've worked on for the past couple of years, all of which can, as I said before, be hosted on Mapbox and then simply referenced via a tileset ID, which allows us on the DVP side to actually reference those in, as I said before, a fairly straightforward manner. So all of those data sets can be defined by a source name that we provide, coupled with that Mapbox ID for the source URL, and then just a binary decision of if it's a vector or raster source layer. With that done, you can then move on to this hierarchy of content management, going from defining the location itself, any possible categories that you would want the eventual maps to fall under. And so obviously with Eurex, we've been devoted to sets style categorization between social, ecological, and technical styles of map definitions. And then within those categories, you can define optional subcategories. And then within either of those, you actually define the map definitions themselves. So the category definition is fairly straightforward. It's just a simple label that then gets ordered. And then likewise, subcategories can apply the same way. With those done, you can then add maps to those categories defined by the Mapbox style spec. So if I were to go into the edit option for the New York ethnicity map, which I showed at the beginning, you'll see the set of parameters that goes into defining that, going from very basic metadata in terms of the name, any possible subtitles or citations you want to use to reference the data being rendered, as well as that Mapbox style spec, which you can see here. So getting fully into this is maybe a little beyond the scope of this discussion, but really basically what's being shown here is the Mapbox standard way of adding visual style to the data formats within the MB tiles datasets that are hosted on the Mapbox side. And so just running through this really quickly, all this is doing is referencing that Buildings New York source, which was originally defined on that managed sources modal, which I just came from. And then once that source layer is being pointed to in the style spec, we're then able to conditionally switch on different feature properties within that data set to highlight the styling. So where the heavy lifting is going on is in this fill extrusion color property. So it's fill extrusion color and not just fill color, because what we're doing is coloring extruded building features from that data set using 3D rendering. And the way that's being done is a single property within the data set, in this case, major population group, is being selected for. And then a categorical series of stops is being used to bind different colors defined by hex values to categorical features within that property. And so here we have 4 different categorical variables within major population group within this source layer, each of which then gets associated with a color. And so now that the layer has been defined, I can just pull it up again. You can see all 4 of those colors associated with the category within each of those census blocks of those buildings, which is most prevalent.
Yeah, this is an important point that this is something that we are often asked for to do, right? There's this additional step to get on the buildings, but these maps get attention. So if you want to kind of understand the actual impact of the building itself, it's basically marrying both the building footprint and volume, and that always works in this sort of Manhattan example. It's less important when you're in LA or Phoenix and other places that go sideways. But just in terms of strategy of data viz, this kind of mapping has seen a lot of feedback and requests. At the same time, you know what the flaws are, right? What I just said exactly about sort of volume and impact on those buildings might be perfectly aligned with, a flooding map, which is also color extruded, or the extruded buildings show that color, simply to kind of show density and what's impacted. But it doesn't work for other, social aspects as well. Although you guys don't need to know that the census data that underlies many of these kinds of analyses still somewhat are related or proportional. So this is a very data viz comment, but just to be fair and call out that this is a feature that has been requested from the beginning after having showed that to your UX folks.
Of course.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just so that I got this right. So you're saying that each building is associated with the census tract data.
In this case, with the flood zone, zone 1 to 5. So what's being projected on the buildings is still exactly the selection of the map layer that you are choosing. Joe explained in this case the demographic, social census data that underlies that. Yes, and that means it also summarizes it, right, per building. Yeah, the most prevalent. You said that, Joe, if you want to repeat that.
Right, yeah, just selecting for the category within each of those census blocks that is just simply either the plurality or the majority. I did kind of jump over, oh, sorry.
But sorry, just one more thing. So when you switch back to ethnicity,
yes,
there's these 2 skyscrapers in downtown that I was curious to understand. This means that the prevalent population in these skyscrapers is African American.
Right. This is actually something that we got into a bit a couple of months ago about some of the fragility or the inaccuracy of the data set being used here, where there is definitely some issues with the definition of the data at hand here, where I think what was originally pointed out was some of the peculiarities of the definition of Midtown in terms of Asian population within that census data. And basically what's happening is due to the simplicity of the style spec definition for ethnicity, those inaccuracies or missing data from the original data set are being carried over to the visual side. And so we're definitely not invulnerable to such issues in terms of questionable data carrying over to questionable visualization, for sure.
Right, so Pablo was able to also point that out specifically, and this is a good example of also sort of a non-aligned example, which in this case, zone 1 to 5 is a much simpler and less aggregate one. So as soon as you're aggregating or you're disaggregating from, American Community Survey, census, then these issues occur, and it comes back to, also the ethics of legends, keys, metadata. As we know, we basically make that statement and then rely on that second look. And I think it gets to the heart of where the limits are and how you also need to sort of stand by some kind of products with sufficient context, and that's what this whole wrapper around Mapbox wants to do, is context. And this is today a little bit recruitment for context, so that we actually can tell this additional paragraph story, explain, the fragility, know when the update of 2020 census happens and things like that.
Right, of course. And aggregation is an important point to highlight here, because obviously what we're doing is binding certain data to individual building footprints. And the way that that's done is through a association of that building footprint, that building definition, with given geographic entities that are used to essentially geographically calculate which building is associated with that overarching aggregated geographic entity. So in the context of the ethnicity data set, as well as some of the others in that social category, those are being drawn from census data that is aggregated at the block level and then bound to buildings which fall into that block, which you can kind of see from the distinctions between some of the building groups or neighborhoods that you can kind of pick out from within the visual representation. But there definitely is a process of aggregation taking place before that data is bound to buildings, which is maybe not apparent on first glance.
I think what we found in the ethnicity situation was that the logic used to specify or assign a major population is it starts with Asian, right? And it asks how many Asian people is in this building. And then it goes to the next number, like or to the next category and checks whether that number is higher than the number of Asian people. And if it's not, then it's still Asian, the one that is highest. And that is why most places that are, or like the places that have zero population are attributed to be Asian, because Asian was zero. And then white, Hispanic, and African American also being zero didn't check
Right.
the binary
So
of being higher than Asian.
Essentially treating Asian as the default value when all were equal or no data.
Exactly. I think
But that depends on the fact that Asian was the first category.
Yes.
It's just the first category, but it's the first category that is being checked. But you see how it's first in the stock.
But you cannot change that first. So when you know that all the other populations are zero, you cannot change that first category to be something else that won't pick up.
Well, so it's important to note that this is not stemming from any logic that we are introducing. What this is coming from is the way that major pop group was defined within the original census data, what Pablo is describing here. And so because that issue exists at the data level, it will bubble up or percolate to the visual level, as long as we're referencing this major pop group. And so in order to correct for that, either we would need more robust, clean data to begin with, or to bridge out that gap by a more comprehensive set of conditional visual styling logic than just referencing major pop group, maybe trying to perform our own calculations or adding in contingencies for these weird edge cases. But it does demonstrate the through line from the original data source to what eventually gets rendered on the website.
I'm really glad we're having this important conversation, because it also gives you a little bit fresh eyes where we can maybe do the second part of this meeting, or just moving forward, so to look at some of these categories and see which ones are, useful, or where sort of a no data stop is the best next choice, or, where we kind of remove or wait for this 2020 census process to then update a certain layer, and we don't do anything before that happens. All of that is valid conversation. It's one that we would love to, engage in. It's also a data ethics space. I think today we also want to make sure we get to make you contributors, so that you're starting to look more carefully at those things. But it's a Slippy map device. That simply also means it's zoomable. It's in the control of a user, and you do not know all of the aggregations that simply happen from how closely you look at a map. So for instance, if you're handing a global product into a scientific paper and put that into 8.5 by 11, right, you're abstracting that away by simply the modality of having handed in a way too high resolution into a way too low output format. And in this case, a Slippy map means it adds both the potential to actually add more information as you get closer, but also the issue of not knowing all of those layers. And so this is just something to know, that the more kind of power you provide in terms of these analyses and literal removal from detail, that you also get dynamically into aggregation issues. So this is an aggregation problem simply through being a slipping map also. Also, Joe, I'm not sure how far you go in processing essentially different zoom levels, but one should say that actually the data tile set creation process does need to consider that. How much detail and polygons and through the buildings are shown at what zoom level is also up for grabs in that creation process. And sort of on a coding level, this can be controlled. It's sometimes not so simple, but Joe, maybe you want to highlight a case or two where this has been interesting or difficult or.
Yeah, for sure. This is especially true in terms of technical constraints, right? Because what's happening here is a fairly high level of graphical computation is required to render each of these 3D objects that are characterized as buildings within each of these data sets. And depending on how dense and detailed each of those 3D objects is, it can be possible to render them all at a given level of detail or zoom level, or they could be too dense to actually preserve within the eventual final data format. And some elements may have to be stripped at different zoom levels. You can kind of see that if I go to coastal flooding, and then I think if I zoom out far enough, you can already see after a certain level of aggregation is hit, Mapbox is unable to preserve the entire span of data that is actually present. And this has direct implications in terms of authorship and presentation of this data. One of the areas that I remember this factored into the most was during the Eurex conversions process for Miami, where they had a number of very high fidelity data sets associated with storm surge and flood zones with a set of building footprint data that was far too dense to preserve at the levels of detail they required to fully illustrate the distinction between each of those zones. And so after a number of series of iterations attempting to reach a final cut of that data, the eventual solution was just to keep it as 2D polygons, as opposed to running the spatial join process, binding that data to the 3D building footprints. And so the process that we've been talking about here of transforming numerical or quantitative data or geospatial data into the kinds of maps that people at this point tend to expect of digital forms is occasionally a process that is not so clear-cut when it comes to that kind of question of fidelity.
If you click on emergency and health facilities, Joe, I think we can pull out a little bit again, because this conversation, you guys are all kind of aware of this and know now what to look for. But if you zoom out, this becomes a scatter plot distribution of facilities. If you zoom in, it becomes exactly what we just talked about in terms of knowing the coding of the building. There's opportunities here, right? This is more information, not less. This is customized for what it needs to say. And so there's these two sides, and this is what we're kind of demonstrating today, how they're kind of used. And sometimes it might be good with point data or places to also keep that in a view. Because this would work in the larger metropolitan area, certainly as just a distribution analysis with these circles. And then when you get closer, you kind of want to know what is the class.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting layer to demo in terms of how it was constructed via styling, where the way that double effect is created or constructed is through a superimposition of 3 different layers. And that is something you can do when defining a map, is have a sequence of different layers styled in specific ways, all rendered at once. And so you can see here, the emergency health services layer is just defined by identifying those building footprints with a building class of whichever we're talking about here. I think these codes map to, in some way, the fire, police, and hospital categories. And what that's doing is just styling the colored building polygons that you see here. Once that is styled, you can then achieve that scatter plot effect by using the same filtering and categorization logic on those building classes, but instead of binding to the building data, we're just rendering very simple circles, coloring those circles based on those categories, and then interpolating their opacity as one zooms in and out. So by the time one gets to a precise enough zoom level to inspect the buildings, the circles have become completely invisible. And as you zoom back out, they gradually and continuously increase in opacity until all you can see are the circles as they occlude the buildings, which is how this effect is generated.
So this is already a non-typical use and kind of hacking it to also make a slippy map add information and be beneficial as opposed to the disaggregate problem. Let's go to kind of a typical example, and maybe can hand it back to you, Joe, to just put ourselves in perspective of what do I do. Now I have a Mapbox tile set hosted on Mapbox. I know where the ID goes, where the sources go. Now it's time for that metadata as well as the color definitions, right? We didn't speak about them. We started talking about categorical, like the building classes. Now we have from very low to high a ramp. So where are these places of definition?
Right, yeah. Why don't we take heat risk as a definition for that? So yeah, just to fully conclude what the fundamental definition of a map would look like. Once you've got what is actually rendered on the map itself as a layer in place via the Mapbox style spec, then the next step is in representing the color ramps used via both legend and the stop sequence that you can see here. So with it being drawn from the New York heat risk source that we've defined previously, then the next step is just being able to associate a legend to represent that same set of color stops within the UI panel that you can see on the right-hand side. So in this case, it's a continuous legend, meaning that different stops in a interval from some beginning stop to some end stop then get categorical color definitions associated with that grade or stop within that sequence, which you can see here with these stops associated with different categorical elements within heat risk values, which have been through like authorial intent associated with these categorical definitions of very low to medium to high. And so once this legend has been defined in addition to the layer styling, it will then render individually on the top right-hand side. And I think that basically covers the fundamental definition of these maps, which, as you've already seen, can then be shown as rendered on the DVP itself. And then each individual view of these maps, including their camera position, zoom extent, and activation within the map hierarchy, can then be encapsulated in this shared link function, which Daniel has touched on already, which essentially wraps up each of those defining parameters of the precise view on the site at that point in time, and then creates a shareable link. So if I were then to zoom out and reposition to a different layer, and then go to that share link, it should know to return back to heat risk at this point in the camera view automatically. And so, as Daniel said, this enables very fluid sharing of individual map views in a dynamic sense, right? Where the default state of the sharing is a live view of that map definition at that point in time, which can then be hosted in other parts of the web.
Great. Yes, this is really use cases are sometimes just the most salient, most important things to share in a setting like this one. So you can imagine where to use it, but Google Docs, Google Sheets, shared stuff, GitHub, all of that comes from being on the same page, and just anecdotally being able to take one large data set and focus in on an area you want to discuss, or just decide which one is the best part to storify this. Think stormwater report, think the 5 neighborhoods selected, would have been, it was designed essentially to exactly be a link that directly goes here and then takes you to these other places for comparison. So all of this is a lot to do with shareability, comparability, teamwork together, and so the share button wants to accommodate that. And it can certainly be extended with embed code and optimizing with static maps and lots of ideas. If we don't use them, we won't prioritize them building them. This is just sort of some of the decisions we have to kind of make. I would love to know if that's interesting. What happens also in the share button, when you click it, it generates a new entry. And we had in the Equity XR project, a side conversation, because it also draws from the database platform, also to simply to know, what do people share? We don't do any cookies. We don't have any kind of tracking and tracing and analyses, but just in terms of what's of interest, because all of these locations are stored, the cameras are stored, it would be possible to have an idea of what is a point of interest.
Yeah.
And so that is side effects. Mm-hmm.
I can actually go into our Firebase DB and show the definition of that share link that I just created. So the way it basically works is everything that is defined on that left-hand side is constructed within this tree hierarchy of the database, including those shareable short links. And so what's happening is the full URL, including the location key, the map key, and the camera position, are being stored in this dictionary of the short links that the share modal is generating. And so each of these then comprises a stored historical definition of an individual view, each of which can then potentially be recorded in terms of visitation.
Perfect. Just to keep maybe sort of medium pace to get to some of the features, at least also one that has never been used is what I would call the slide deck, or the museum mode that is auto forward, taking you places, showing you things. Is this something we can go next, Joe?
Sure, yeah. We can, why don't we segue into a discussion of the kind of narrative content that we can layer on top of the rendered map definitions. So now that I'm logged in as an admin and an editor, that gives me the chance to define map agnostic content in terms of narrative and different UI features, and then associate them with maps in a free-form manner. So if I go to the manage content modal here, you'll see the list of text-based narrative contents that we've defined so far, as well as the UI template associated with each of them. So if I go to this bottom one here, labeled time in with a template of carousel, you'll see it will pull up a rich text editor, which will enable me to define in a fairly typical content management paradigm, different UI elements, each of which has some text content associated with it, as well as, in this case for carousel, potential actions to fire on load. So this is a very simple demo of this feature. We've got 3 cards with just a bit of representative text to bind to each of them. And then you'll see at the bottom, on load, different waypoint actions. So if I close this and then inspect each of those waypoints in the manage actions modal, you'll see what each of those does, which if I go into the definition for waypoints 1, 2, and 3, what it's doing is being defined by a map position, including longitude, latitude, and then pitch, bearing, and zoom in the exact same way that New York City was defined as a location. So now that waypoint 1 is defined by these parameters, what that means is on that content for timing on card 2, as soon as that card is rendered within the narrative, that action is triggered and the camera pans to that waypoint. Similarly for card 1 and waypoint 2, those are backwards for some reason, and then card 3 and waypoint 3. So if I then go to median income, which is the data layer that we've actually associated this content with via the original map definition modal, that means if we then go to median income, the map is rendered as normal, and a new additional UI layer is presented on top as well. And so you'll see here that with card 1 being the first defined within this carousel template, it shows it first, and then on load, each of those waypoints gets fired as an action as you transition through the narrative. And so this can obviously be expanded to include a much broader set of narrative content in association with however you want to detail the visual map layers that have semantic connections to that narrative. In this case, this is all being done on click triggers, but we are currently actually debugging a feature to have this also be done through an automated tour. So instead of waypoints 1 or 2 being fired based on position within the carousel, what can be done is associating one action with an action to follow it with, and a certain amount of time you want to add as the interim before that automatically transitions from one waypoint to the other. That feature isn't quite stable enough to demo in a reliable way right now, but it is something that is definitely on the docket.
Yeah, as we're thinking about, a interactive in a kind of standalone museum setting or something that is set up that way, this is exactly one of those modes where you could think of sort of an auto slideshow. I would just call what we're doing here different levels of providing context and storifying. So what has been, for instance, on the UX 2080 scenario, a food security narrative that Tisha provided, and is what is the split screen between the story and the map, sort of equal eye to eye level, is basically one version exactly of making essentially content. In this case, we're using cards, which can be also fully styled. So think of that as basically a Google slide that you forward and you have a caption there or credit. But it could certainly be a full, paper presentation where each one of them is a chapter section or something like that. And the side panel that can be collapsed to go away or to come back is a third version of that kind of work. And the Climate Equity XR is basically hacking this content management system to now become a mobile app and to feed this content to something that's immersive as well. So I just want to be sort of generous in terms of how we are trying to keep continuity. Of course, it all make reusability high and sort of make the investment in editorial work also worthwhile because it can be used in this different context. And certainly as being an editor and a viewer, you are a stakeholder and can also co-create. So two editors can work on the same story. It doesn't have to be public. It can be private at first and then be published later. So I'm getting a little bit into user permissions and things as I'm setting you guys up already live to get into that platform. So know that you will end up on the nyc.Urban Systems Lab site. You will be editors. And as such, don't delete too much, add your own and only delete and edit this. We want to basically do that risk to give you the tools with teeth to do things today. And because you're all lab members, there's absolutely no hesitation. In terms of backing things up and things, we will still be doing that. So don't be frightened. But it's also something where it's not a test sandbox, it's the real thing. And so I think that will be a good balance between you thinking about your next paper release or your collaborative work or your next show or demo or slideshow. It takes a little bit of work to get it set up, but sometimes it might be the right shareable product in the end that all the hosting is done for. And we don't need a subscription for it. We don't need another license for it. It's already there. We control everything here.
And are there other things where it's like really important to know not to mess with something so we don't break it? Or those are the main things?
A good approach is that you add your own sort of layer and start from there and sort of open up things to look at them, but don't edit them down. Don't get into the code editing of other layers that have been saved already. But every modal has a cancel button on it, so no worries.
Okay.
You know how to use a UI. I think I'm representing that correctly, Joe. If you go to manage maps and you press the delete button on a map, it won't ask you 4 times whether you want to delete that. It will just delete it. So
that is true.
Okay. So don't delete it. Yeah.
We do periodic caching of the database though, so it's not the end of the world if the unthinkable happens and there is some implosion of such, but I think it's just best to use your own discretion, and there's very little chance of anything disastrous happening. The other thing to mention on that front is, as of a couple of months ago, we also have a development playground hosted on AWS. It's currently reading from the old Eurex dev database, but it could easily function as a testing ground for playing around with whatever map definition you're looking to create, just to experiment with visually or logically. And it would also then be very easy to transpose those map definitions from that development playground to the real deal on either the NYC DVP or whatever version of the platform you're looking into.
I'll take the question already as maybe a good next step, where we would potentially also just share something called sandbox.urbansystemslab.com and make that development sandbox a sandbox, so we don't have the discussion of what you're deleting.
Right.
They are just necessarily not connected, and we will still move things over. So it's balancing complexity and amount of conversations to get your stuff live with actually providing you with a tool that is live immediately. And so, Chris, you're already an editor in this. We should definitely, just to help out, if there's also questions in terms of, is this ready, or is this the right version? Is this the right use case? NYC.Urban Systems Lab is 1 out of 3 instances, and we're not touching any of the Eurex stuff. We're not touching any of the stormwater stuff. So they're all literally separate things. And we'll just probably, Joe, because we already have it hosted anyhow online, the dev, maybe do that sandbox.
Yeah, of course.
Sarah, did you want to jump in too? Do you have a quick question?
Yeah, I did, but it's okay.
Okay.
I will maybe though reach out to you, Daniel, and maybe Joe, with some ideas as to add some layers that I'm working with in Edgemere, Queens, I've been trying to see how Edgemere Queens looks like in the map right now, and sort of like some of the data is not showing. But I would be interested in adding a layer and see how that layer works out, and whether this platform can host stories connected to individual lots. But it's something I will contact you about.
Of course, yeah, no, I will definitely be available to assist in any way I can in terms of getting some of that more neighborhood-specific data rendered as maps within the platform, of course.
And that's always the case. We're a generous group. Just always CC in this case something like this also to Chris, and discuss that also with Timon as a project, because none of this work is funded separately. It's all GCR. We're kind of pulling into certain directions, and one of the outcomes I was hoping for today is a certain level of brainstorming where also Timon and Chris can endorse. Okay, let's make a story. Here we have a good cause. A need and even a demo coming up, and let's do that one. And then Joe can also be a wing person, and once we because it needs to be funded and invoiced in the right place, we want to make sure that those priorities bubble up to, I would say, even a lab meeting or something.
Right. Yeah, of course, we'll do.
Perfect. Good. Same as with these 3 instances. We have 3 instances because there were 3 grants, and we want to think beyond grants, but we're still thinking in terms of prioritization, working with Atlanta for GCR right now, going through another 10 layers or so we need to add there, and we want to sort of get our own next steps in order. Full disclosure about prioritizing. Cool. Joe, did you want? Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask if maybe we have 20 minutes to do that brainstorming or ask questions about specific kind of needs people may have in the lab, like Audrey or Claudia, Pablo, if you guys have ideas. Or I mean, I'm very much interested in the storytelling feature, but go ahead, Claudia.
I think it will be cool to explore this narrative tool, because sometimes we work with the story maps, but maybe we need to flash out something out and we already have the layers here. We might as well just do this like kickoff in the data visualization platform. And then if we want to expand it, we can do the whole lift up in story maps. But since the story maps is more work, which for some projects could be okay. But sometimes when we think that, oh, we can do story maps, maybe a faster way to do it could be here. Then if we have more time, we can transition into something else.
It's a perfect way, and it follows what Vero is already asking, because we're maybe giving too many opportunities to start, and that's where conversation gets a little bit cross-wired maybe. But because you can do also your own Mapbox work that doesn't involve necessarily Joe doing it for you, we can certainly get something started or start in the Google Doc like Claudia you're suggesting, and we're making it sort of this interactive editing tool that then bubbles up to become a story map, because maybe a product like this is exactly what the client is looking for. And so I think that's just the lower hanging fruit. We can also control it better. And in the end, it's still clear that these layers that have been uploaded to Mapbox could certainly also be uploaded to Esri or another product to get it going.
I wonder if a bypass to the story maps, like Claudia was saying, I don't know if this is what you were saying right now, but would be just taking advantage of this platform and this feature and exploring how to embed it in Medium posts, which I bet is possible. I feel like it's like I've seen it before. And in many ways, it probably can replicate what a story map is in a more flexible way.
Yeah, we should take note of that in a way. We should have the answer. I think Medium doesn't allow the injection of that kind of a level of content, but my allusion to something Mapbox offers, and that is you take the exact map and you're asking the server to return to you a JPEG. or PNG instead of the whole iframe with everything in it, which Medium would just not allow. Is the solution, right? And that's if we're writing Medium posts and we're going with essentially the quarterly or something and want to connect the two, this might be a smart way to do it, or a reason for us to build this other thing, which I think is not too complicated, but we need to always prioritize.
You can also do a screencast pretty easily, right? You just kind of set the window, you talk, the thing pans as you're talking, and that could be a quick like 2-minute moment, and we can embed that easily in Medium. And that's
exactly. That's on a video, which is also not any hostile, injection of active Mapbox content with, thousands of lines of JavaScript coming along. This is the reason why Medium wouldn't allow the active ingredient, the active script. But absolutely, Chris, you're already talking here about making it the moment, like one that you're featuring, you're talking over, you're personifying, you're making this a shareable social media asset. And certainly this can be done. And because Slack has really pushed its video screen capture feature also the last 2 weeks. So I think everybody got, saw this little message window, how to quickly work around something. Even Slack can help with that recording.
But just to circle back to Pablo's point, I mean, there are writing editors out there that are not Medium, that are built for academic research, where you can embed live maps. Definitely Cargo is allowed. I'm not sure if Mapbox is, but just to get that idea that the map lives in the paper and it's not a screenshot. So editors of that kind do exist. It's just not Medium, and it's for another purpose, which is publishing scientific papers.
Yep, good point. It's not a technical conversation, really. It's really a dissemination one. If you want to get it into Medium, if you want to get it into the science, if you want to get into Twitter, right, you follow the rules of those moments. And what Chris just mentioned is video as a medium, which would make it in all of them, also as a moving image. So we just need to know, and I think it's a good conversation amongst us. And Claudia will pick up on that too. You're working on something, then you updated it yesterday. You're expecting your live map to be live and updating here too, but it doesn't until someone goes in and updating again. And this is exactly the single source of truth that we want to avoid, where we don't version control within. And this is basically doing that, or at least it doesn't create this sort of branches that are outdated. And as soon as you're capturing it, screen capture of any kind, you're freezing that in time. And by you talking about it, citation, is an important piece there. It's clear that it's time-stamped. Not everybody's problem, but a large portion of my life is version control. So I do see this as a real thing, and dissemination to get sort of social media involved, including some of the quarterlies, speak a certain platform language. And we won't just move over to the other one because it can technically provide more, just because it needs to fit there. But point taken. And in the end, it's an iframe. It goes to any blog. It can go to any WordPress, any personal website. It's just an iframe.
I guess I missed a bit. So the trickiness with defining a caption for a particular census, or like one of these data layers to say, hey, the census is included here, but this is incomplete. Here's the caveat. That's hard to do, Daniel, or like would it require like an extra step or something?
No, this would be simply, the site panel that would provide context, any qualifiers, asterisks, citations that we want. And here Joe is pulling up the citation
okay. So
field to do a real citation. That would work. We mostly talk about when does a live map become an asset that is timestamped. That is the moment you take a screenshot. That's the moment you screen capture something. And then it's sort of the person's duty, who is the author of that, to cite it in a way that we're not looking at the wrong thing. And just because some of the story maps that have been created recently, including Baltimore, have their own deadlines and update frequencies, that the story map itself doesn't automatically update until you update it. And that's where I'm talking about. It's not a small issue. It's something that we really want to be mindful of. When does an asset become an asset? And when we are relying on database platform to always show the latest and greatest, and we take our ethics and curatorial approach to make sure that that's the case. So Joe, any hints here for citation? Do you want anything you want people to do there, or?
Oh, yeah, I could just demo creation of that real quick. So the default way of doing this may be is a little too bare bones to introduce the kind of like longer form caveat that you're mentioning, Chris. But what you can do is on the legend definition or the map definition, which will eventually render on the legend, would be to give some definition of a citation in terms of a label, and then a URL to associate with it. I don't really have one on hand, but I could use the Mapbox URL as an example, where once I've done that and I hit save, the next time I pull up that layer, which I think was child population, yeah, then, oops, the citation would appear in the legend, and you can just jump to the URL provided. And so obviously this is not a actual citation, but you could provide some article link or standard citation page to associate with that map.
That solves some of the citation as academic citation, but it does all the ERAM links. ERAMs has inspired that too, right? Where we're kind of pointing to a ERAM source, and there is all the metadata. And we've worked hard to get ERAMs be that repository for all of UREX, right? We would point there.
Precisely, yeah.
Okay, so let's check our agenda. I think this sort of brainstorming would also be a good next step, just in regards to other things. Joe, let's see. We want to make sure that the how-to repository is something we also pull up and share folks into, because there is sometimes interest, and also in UREX, we have been training folks, city representatives on particular teams to do this process and get tile sets started. It sometimes, takes too long to demonstrate this quickly. And you also see it's not a fully automatic process that is sometimes simple. And that's why someone like Joe needs to be a fairly brilliant person already to navigate everything thrown, at you from, how about this FTP server, how this download. It comes from all kinds of sites. And so Joe is also in this case a clearinghouse to understand what's being asked here, make sure it sees all of the metadata. And so we're hoping to, in this case with the repository, to share in the same resources Joe has been onboarded with and we've trained other people with. And so that's a GitHub repo with some of the more details, and we have also your email addresses. Joe, do we need GitHub IDs?
I think it might be a private repo within the Urban Systems Lab account. So I think you might need to be a team member for that account to access it, but I'm not entirely sure.
It's not a problem if you know what GitHub is and you are planning to truly run code on your own laptop. This is the moment to drop your GitHub ID quickly in the chat, and we'll also pick that one up and just add you there.
Yeah, exactly.
Certainly also free and a good thing to have, even if you don't use GitHub. It's good to have a name there so you actually can fork other folks' stuff too.
That would be great. So the repo that Daniel is referencing here is this one entitled MBTiles Workflow, which is one that O'Share created a couple of years ago. O'Share was one of the original minds behind the design of this website. And so when she was building it, she also created this run-through repo, which is essentially just a README detailing the steps required to get GIS-style data from various different origins into the forms required of Mapbox, where each of these, as I mentioned before, is a data layer which was created via upload from MBTiles format, which essentially creates a wrapper around vector or raster data, whether that be in GeoJSON, shapefile, or GeoTIFF, any of the numerous formats within a new standard that is of higher fidelity and definitely higher density in order to account for the kinds of rendering requirements needed by Mapbox in a basic sense, as well as some of the user interactions that could be expected of someone manipulating one of these Mapbox layers in terms of the kind of zooming and pivoting that one can obviously do in Mapbox. And so what this repo is essentially documenting is a straightforward set of steps to take, assuming that you, as a data scientist or whatever your position might be, might already have on hand that you would like to represent within this Mapbox context. And so basically it breaks down into two separate pipelines, one for vector-based data and one for raster-based data, where you essentially build what is called a Docker container, which is a separate technology that is kind of its own ecosystem. But for our purposes, you basically only need to follow the set of instructions detailed within this repo to get it up and running. And then from there, that gives you access to an environment with a number of GIS-associated command line tools to begin transformation of, for example, a geotiff into an MB-tiles raster, which would be done with this GDAL command line tool. Or if you've got a vector data set in shapefile or GeoJSON format, what you can do is use the Mapbox provided utility Tippecanoe, which can be used to do pretty much the exact same thing from a different standpoint in transforming that vector data into a similar standard of MB-tiles format. And so this repository essentially just does as I've described. It details the steps required for this set of transformations, including reprojection into that geographic projection standard that Daniel mentioned before, the WGS84 that Mapbox requires. And then the representative commands for each of these tools, which can be used to make these transformations. So I am not going to run through the execution of each of these individual commands, partially because with datasets of this size, they can often take a very, very long time to fully output. But I do have a representative one just set up on my terminal right now, where on the right-hand side, I've got the Docker container with the GDAL commands for a raster up, and on the left-hand side, I've got my home environment with Tippecanoe installed to deal with vector data. So if I queue up this command on the left-hand side, you'll see Tippecanoe with this option here, drop densest as needed. So that is something which refers to that original problem that I mentioned when discussing Miami sites, or rather the Miami UREX project, where the building data from the original vector sources can be too dense to preserve to the full extent required of Mapbox's higher visual requirements. And so by providing this option to the Tippecanoe command, what that's essentially telling the process is, or it's providing a strategy to adopt when faced with this issue. If it's taking in more data than it can actually preserve in an individual area, if let's say the Miami downtown is too dense to represent at a certain zoom level, it's saying, pick these features that are dense enough, that are so dense of a certain standard to drop first, and then proceed from there. And so if you go to the Tippecanoe documentation page on GitHub, it will provide the full list of various strategies that you can adopt to try to finagle or wrestle this data into a format that you deem as the author of the new MB-tiles format sufficient or best fit. So if I run this command, saying drop density is needed, set the zoom level to 14, using these other flags to name the tile set that I want to be Georgia building footprints.mb tiles. And then
we don't see your command line.
Oh,
you're
wow.
only sharing that window, but that's cool. I mean, you were talking about those flags, and I would also here say that
I am sorry about that. Let me share my terminal.
It was perfectly clear even without seeing that, because we didn't get so far in the command. It's important to say though that GDAL is and Python is something Pablo, for instance, uses all the time.
Right.
This is just now another thing that uses the same with full control and parameters to run this sort of bottom up. The good news is for those who actually don't want to run this ever, there is Mapbox drag and drop, right? So there's a dataset tab where you can just take the dataset and drop it in. If you're lucky enough that it's small enough, then it also doesn't matter which type of data it might be. It does GeoJSON, it does CSV. So it might simply be another way to kind of generate something that you can link and host basically as a tile through the Mapbox Studio.
That is true. Yes, it's good that Daniel mentioned that. Where what I've described is if you want precise, finite control over as much detail in the map definition you're creating as possible, this gives you that leverage that you need. But it is true that Mapbox is a powerful and flexible enough service and website that it will also accept just basic TIFF and shapefile